For a retro gaming enthusiast, Japan is a downright magical place. I don't think there's anywhere else on the planet that has its sheer number of vintage video game shops per capita. And a lot of those shops have stock that spans nearly 50 years of gaming history. There are literally places where you can buy a brand new PS5, then go up one flight of stairs and find an Intellivision just chilling on the floor. Now, before you go rush off to Japan with dollar symbols in your eyes, drooling over the thought of a mint condition boxed copy of the original Final Fantasy, let me temper your expectations. 1, buying games in Japan is very popular, meaning you're gonna have a lot of competition. And 2, all those really cool items that you're probably dreaming about, yeah, those were likely picked off like decades ago. So with all that in mind, let's take a look at probably the most famous place to go shopping for retro games in all of Japan, Akihabara. Akihabara is kind of crazy. It's actually a pretty sizable neighborhood in Tokyo, but it definitely is most well known for a section near its JR station called Electric Town. And this is where you'll find a bunch of shops that specialize in retro games. First and foremost, there's the king of them all, Super Potato. This shop boasts 3 stories of gaming glory, including a small arcade and snack shop on the top floor. I'm particularly fond of the little poop candies. It's located on the southern end of Electric Town, pretty close to the JR station, and because of this, it's often the first place that gaming tourists stop. Like all used goods stores, the stock frequently changes, but every time I've gone there, they've had an overwhelmingly wide variety of really good condition games, a lot of which are still in the box. The prices for non-premium games are reasonable, ranging from about 500 yen to 2,000, which as of the making of this video is roughly $3 to $15 US. More expensive stuff can be found in the various locked display cases scattered around the shop. Notably, I came across a box copy of Rockman 1 for $750. I did not buy said copy of Rockman. Just north of Super Potato lies another awesome shop in Akiba, Mandrake. The Mandrake complex encompasses an entire monolithic 8-story building, and it kind of reminds me of an Arasaka way station you might find somewhere outside of Night City. Mandrake is a bit of a different experience than Super Potato, as it's more of a one-stop shop where each floor is dedicated to a different aspect of otaku culture. The items that they stock tend to be in very good condition, with most of the games in their own individual protective cases. The shop strikes me as the kind of place to visit when you're looking for something very specific and want a high quality version for your collection. So there are a bunch of other places in Akihabara that I want to tell you about, but before I do that, I've got to give a shout out to my supporters on Patreon. The patrons get a slew of perks, including ad-free videos, behind the scenes updates, and other bonus content in between episodes. Okay, back to Japan. Heading back into the heart of Electric Town and a little to the north, one can find my favorite retro game shop in Tokyo, Beep. This shop is basically a paradise for anyone who's into the intersection of both video games and old school computer programming. One of the coolest parts are all the old systems that are hooked up and running game demos. Some of the specialized gaming CRTs from back in the day really hold up and look absolutely fantastic, especially when displaying the 16-bit era games. They have a pretty wide variety of goods, spanning from classic TV system games to computer games and replacement hardware. One part of the shop is even dedicated to old computer and programming manuals, which I kinda got a kick out of. Right next door to Beep is another game shop called Suragaya, which caters pretty much exclusively to the console gamer crowd. The shop seems to have a pretty high trade volume, because multiple times now I've come across some really esoteric collector's items while browsing their wares. For instance, during my last trip, they had a fully boxed and excellent condition family computer robot just hanging out on the floor. The shop has a wide selection of games all the way up to the PS4 era and a respectable amount of hardware for sale. Like Beep, it's a one-floor shop, so it can get pretty cramped as a lot of tourists tend to flock here, desperately searching for a small piece of nostalgia. The last spot that I suggest when visiting Akiba is called Friends, which is quietly nestled away from the more hectic areas of Electric Town on the 3rd floor of a pretty nondescript building on the district's northern end. It's honestly a really relaxing place to visit, since it doesn't seem to attract nearly as many tourists as the big name shops in the southern end of the district. The prices for some of the more iconic titles, like this copy of Pokemon Yellow, were pretty steep, but that said, this was the only shop in Akihabara where I can even find the game. So Akihabara is great, but it's not the only neighborhood that has a concentration of game shops in Japan. Ikebukuro, for instance, is another major shopping center in Tokyo, and it's only about a half-an-hour train ride away. The neighborhood boasts its own Super Potato branch, a Mandrake location, and a giant arcade where you can play as many claw games and Mario Kart races as your little otaku heart desires. Outside of Tokyo, there are, get this, other cities in Japan. One notable example is Osaka, which has its own Electric Town. This neighborhood has pretty much everything you'd expect: anime, manga, figurines, collectible cards, maid cafes, and game shops. I kind of like Denden Town in Osaka better than Akihabara because it's less packed with a bunch of tourists and it's got a much more chilled vibe. It also seems way less picked over. For instance, when I went to the Super Potato branch in Osaka, it was the only place where I could find one of the items that I was desperately searching for, a Game Boy Light, which I have never seen once in any of my trips to game shops in Tokyo. While the shops I mentioned so far are great and definitely worth visiting, they're less than ideal if you're looking to find a diamond in the rough. But don't worry, there is still a way to do some amount of bargain hunting for retro games while in Japan. All you gotta do is visit one of the many Bookoff locations. Bookoff is a chain of stores that specializes in selling used books and manga, along with things like DVDs, CDs, and video games. In addition to Bookoff, there are also Hardoff and Hobbyoff stores, with Hardoff focused on used electronics and musical instruments, and Hobbyoff catering more strongly to the otaku crowd with things like toys and figurines. Now again, let me set some expectations. You're probably not going to find some super rare items at a Bookoff, but what you do stand a good chance of finding are slightly less collectible items at really good prices. For instance, while browsing the selection at the Bookoff near Hatagaya Station in Tokyo, I found a loose copy of Final Fantasy III for 550 yen, which is about 500 to 1,000 and less than you'd find it at a place like Mandrake. The most impressive Bookoff location that I visited was in downtown Shinjuku. This place was huge and had a giant selection of games spanning from the NES era all the way to modern PlayStation titles. As far as Hardoff is concerned, I managed to hit up a few locations, the most notable of which was right next to the Mandrake complex in Akihabara. You won't find too many bargain games or consoles, but the store did have a crazy selection of old electronics, parts, and instruments across multiple floors. Hobbyoff stores are a little more rare, but I did manage to visit a couple. One location was on the north end of central Tokyo near Kitasenju Station, and it was mostly toys and figures, but they had a fair amount of video games, and I even found a box copy of The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. Also, Kitasenju is only a couple stops away from the Tokyo Skytree, so you can easily visit the location either before or after confronting your debilitating fear of heights. Thanks for watching NestHacker. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and tell me what you thought about it down in the comments. If you really like what I do and want to help support the channel, then head over to patreon.com/NestHacker and become a patron today. Okay, time for me to reorganize my entire video game collection. Again.